Hello, and welcome back to Animated Literacy. This is part 4 of the overview and research behind animated literacy. In part 1, we talked a lot about the role of emotion and prior knowledge in attention, memory, and comprehension. In this segment, we're going to be talking about two more critical elements that are often left out of reading instruction when students are first learning to read. These two elements are context and movement, which also aid in memory and comprehension, just as emotion and prior knowledge do. Robert Ornstein is a researcher who pioneered the studies in how the right and the left hemisphere of the brain work differently but together in order to produce success for people. He tells us in his book, The Right Mind, that context is defined as a weaving together. Having a context organizes information, making it more comprehensible and more memorable. The first person to hire me to do workshops was Dr. Emerald Randolph, who was the special education coordinator for Chula Vista City Schools to the south of San Diego. And she referred to animated literacy this way. She says that animated literacy puts hooks in the brain for children to hang their memories on so that they can remember long term what has been taught. And this is very similar to what Robert Ornstein is talking about. Robert Ornstein tells us that given the amount of information taught without context, we don't need a special right brain learning program, but simply to put the large picture first in front of the student. To explain how context works, I'm going to use an analogy of a jigsaw puzzle. Many of us have gone to the store and purchased a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and spent hours putting that puzzle together. When you go to the store to purchase the jigsaw puzzle, chances are it's emotion that is driving our attention and making the decision as to which puzzle we buy, because we want to buy a puzzle that's going to make us feel good. So we buy it as a very holistic decision, and this is very much a right hemispheric process. Then we take the puzzle home, we open up the box, and we dump all the pieces out. So now the left hemisphere can start to take over as it's beginning to assemble those pieces. Very few people would open that puzzle box, dump the pieces out, and throw the box away. Instead, they put the puzzle box right next to where they're going to be assembling the puzzle. Why? Because as they're putting those puzzle pieces together, they need to keep referencing back to the whole, checking with the picture on the front of the box to see if they're assembling the puzzle correctly. Now, as you're starting to put that puzzle together, very few people randomly start putting pieces together. They have a plan in mind. Most people would start with the corners. Then they would move to the edges and assemble the frame of the puzzle. And then they'd start looking to see which interior part of the puzzle they're going to put together next. Babies learning language do a very similar thing. If parents are reading to babies before birth, as we talked about in our last session, and the reading that they're doing has rhythm and melody and rhyme structure, it's sing-songy, then children recognize those elements of music and can differentiate between a story that was read to them before birth and one that was not read to them before birth. So you can think of that as the puzzle box. They don't know about the pieces in the puzzle yet, but they know what the whole sounds like. Then, just like assembling the puzzle, they have a plan in mind. So after birth, the first thing that comes into play is the gestural stage of language development. You stick out your tongue, baby sticks their tongue back out in response. You make a silly face, the baby makes a silly face. And through this use of gesturing, and many people use baby signs along with this period of time to communicate with their babies before they can speak. So through the use of gestures, babies are learning what your emotions are, and they're learning a great deal about language. Then at about 2 to 4 months old, babies move to the next stage of language development or start to manipulate the next puzzle piece. Now they start to coo vowel sounds. So vowels come before consonants in a natural order, yet reading programs generally teach consonants first. Patricia Kuhl, who is the ultimate expert in this area, tells us that all around the world, the first 3 vowel sounds that babies produce are oo, e, and ah. So babies are ooh-eeing and awing, and moms and dads are looking at their babies and ooh-eeing and awing back and forth with them. And so they're developing a knowledge of the sound structure of language and laying the foundation. Then at about 7 to 8 months old, babies move on to the next piece of the puzzle and they start to produce consonants. But they don't isolate their consonants the way they do vowels. Instead, they combine their consonants with the vowels that they have been producing for several months. So they put a consonant in front of a vowel, and now they start to produce utterances like goo goo and gaga and baba. So now they're babbling, and babbling is very much like the phonological awareness that we're trying to teach children to do so that they can recognize words later on in their reading instruction. After they have babbled for some time, at about 12 months old, they start to produce their first words. Now, their first words start to come in very slowly. So at first, they may only produce a new word every 1 to 2 days. But while they're producing only a couple of words, they're comprehending, it's estimated, as many as 55 words. Then they gradually start rising to that 50-word level. Once they hit about 50 words, an explosion takes place. Now, instead of producing a new word every 2 to 3 days, they're producing 1 to 3 new words every day, but they're comprehending 7 or 8 new words each day. That propels them into the next stage of language, which is the 2-word phrase of language development. Now, children are comprehending 2-word phrases when they're producing single words, but now they're producing those 2-word phrases. And this is a real milestone in language development because word order changes word meaning. If you say to a young child the 2 words, hug Teddy, the baby will go to the teddy and give it a hug. But if you say to the same child, Teddy hug, chances are they'll have the teddy bear give them a hug. One of the tragedies of word order is that John loves Mary does not mean the same as Mary loves John. So now children go along for several months producing 2-word utterances until they start to move into the next stage, which is 3-word. When they start producing 3- and 4-word utterances, they need something to hold those words together or to glue them. So they start to use what many language researchers refer to as grammatical glue. So now they begin to produce words like the and in and she and it to be able to glue their other words together as they're rising to the level of the language that they heard even before birth. So not starting with a context and reading to children so that they know what book language sounds like early in life, I believe is very much like taking a jigsaw puzzle, a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, dumping out all the parts, and trying to have a person assemble it without ever seeing the picture on the front of the box, because you don't know what your end product is. So it's critical that we both start with the whole, that we read to children from books with rhythm and melody and rhyme structure, and that we follow the natural sequence of language development as children are moving from early pieces of the puzzle to their later pieces. My first education in context came from a child in my classroom. I had a boy in my classroom who for 4 to 6 months I tried to teach the name of the letter that his name began with and the sound of that letter. And each day we would do lots of multisensory experiences with the letter at the front of his name. We would make it with jump ropes. We would feel sandpaper letters. We would draw it in the sand. Everything I could think of to help this child remember the shape, the name, and the sound of the letter. And 4 or 5 months later, he still could not come in the next day and tell me the letter or its sound. Then one day it dawned on me I was treating him like an empty vessel, which at the beginning of my teaching career I was told children are. I was trying to dump information into his brain as though it were empty. Then I started to recognize that he had lots of information in his brain. He could name the children in the classroom. He could name the foods that he liked to eat. He could name the places that he liked to go and the games that he liked to play. He just couldn't remember anything I was teaching him. So it became clear that if he was going to learn the sounds and the letters of the alphabet, I was going to have to put them into a context much like the people and the foods and the things that he remembered. So at first I wasn't looking to write a program. I was looking for a program that personified the alphabet and gave characters some kind of a context. So I found a program that did a reasonably good job of teaching consonant sounds. And it was based on using lots of nouns, like their character for B was beautiful buttons, okay? So he picked up letter names from that program and he picked up letter sounds, but the letter names and sounds he learned were the consonants. When it came to vowels, he was still struggling, as were many of the children in my classroom. And I had known from teaching upper grades before primary grades that the upper grade kids who read well know vowels. The upper grade kids who don't read well don't know vowels. So this was something I felt was critical to his reading success. So I had a group of 10 kids who I was trying to teach the sound of short A to using this other program. And the program that I was using was supposed to have a Miss A, and she was supposed to be having a cold, and she was pictured on the wall like this with her finger under her nose going, achoo. Well, many people say achoo instead of achoo, so there was kind of a confusion, I think, built into the program there. And this one group of 10 students that I was trying to teach the sound to, every day when I asked them the sound of A, they would tell me, And I'd say, no, it says say and they'd say, So after a period of time, I knew I had to do something different if they were going to learn the sound of short A. So I looked at the picture on the wall, and I said to the children, I don't want you to tell me the sound of A. Instead, I want you to show me the sound of A. Take your index finger, bring it underneath your nose, and touch your nose. And when you touch your nose, think of having a cold and go, ah. So 10 kids in my lowest reading group put their finger up in the air, brought it underneath their nose, and said, ah. And I thought, oh, they finally got it. So then I said to them, tell me the sound of A. And they all said, I said, show me the sound of A. And they all went, ah. Tell me the sound of A, Show me the sound of A, Tell me the sound of A, Show me the sound of A, And every time I said, show me the sound, and they touched their nose, they gave me the right response. Every time they dropped the gesture, they gave me the incorrect response. And they had no idea that they were giving me two different responses. So I knew there was something unconscious going on in there, and it was like, wow, this is powerful. And someday I'm going to understand it. And I finally do understand it, and I'll explain the research behind it a little bit later. But for now, we'll just talk about those gestures. So then I started to create my own characters. When I created my own characters, I knew that silliness was something that children buy into. If you want to get kids' attention, do something silly, just like parents do when a newborn baby is born, and they make all of those silly faces in order to get the child's attention. This is a quote that comes from Priscilla Vale in her book, Words Fail Me. She says, young children delight in silliness, alliteration, rhymes, repetitive refrains, nonsense words. Early delight in wordplay augurs later delight in reading. So when I created my characters, I made my characters as silly as I could make them, and I made an individual character for each sound in the English language. And in their story, there's a ton of repetition of the character's sound, and they each have a song, and there's a lot of repetition of the sound in their song as well. I also wanted my characters to have all of the elements of storytelling. In Becoming a Nation of Readers, they were highly critical of many of our early reading books, because they said they fail to tell a story. They're so focused on teaching word recognition that they often do not tell a story. So in Become a Nation of Readers, it tells us that in order to have a complete story, you have to have characters. The characters have to be placed in a setting. They have to have problems to resolve. They have to undertake actions to resolve their problems. And finally, at the end of the story, they have to have feelings of success or failure. So as I was building my stories for animated literacy, I made sure that I put all of those storytelling elements into play. So I wrote the stories and I taught them for 1 year, and we had a lot of fun with the silly stories. But the end of the year, when we did the CTBS test to measure student progress, not a whole lot had happened. My students were only scoring very slightly better than they did the previous year. So I knew there had to be some element that was still missing. Because a number of the children in my lowest reading group came from second language homes and did not speak English when they started the year, I was also looking at a lot of second language research. And James Ashford had come out with a program called Learning Another Language Through Actions, often referred to as Total Physical Response. So I started putting lots of verbs into my stories. Now, at the same time, there was a Head Start classroom that was just across the hall from me. And Head Start was a program for very low income preschoolers to kind of give them a head start before they went into kindergarten. And the Head Start teacher was volunteering to try out all of my stories in her classroom. And she always came back to me with one of two responses. She would say, oh, this one works great, or this one needs more actions. And each time she came back and said they needed more actions, I went back and wrote more verbs into my story. So my stories became very rich in verbs. But I still, even though I'd had that experience of the kids gesturing, it had not dawned on me to use a verb to have the kids gesture each sound that they were producing so that they could develop phonological awareness and word recognition. Later, a teacher at one of my workshops came to me, and she was a speech language specialist, and she said, well, Leslie Olswang is doing very similar to what you're talking about. And this was a simple, quick assessment that she developed that could be given to children at about 2 years old to determine which ones needed speech intervention and which ones were progressing fine without it. And just like I talked about with the parts of the puzzle, she assessed gestures, babble, first 50 words, imitation, and vocabulary. And when she assessed vocabulary, it wasn't nouns that she was looking at. She assessed whether or not children were using general all-purpose or high-frequency verbs like want, go, get, do, etc. And if those were their primary verbs, they were considered to be in trouble. The kids who were producing lower frequency, higher meaning verbs like bounce and bump and balance and things like that were in a much better shape in terms of their language development. Most reading programs have used nouns for their association for sounds. So you have B is for ball, or in the case of the program I was using, B was for beautiful buttons. I didn't find any that were using verbs, but animated literacy does. Then later, I found a study that's in What's Going On in There from Lise Elliott, who tells us that verbs and nouns function very differently in the brain. Verbs are in the front and nouns are in the rear. More than any other part of speech, verbs are the central components of grammar. Verbs also not only control our grammar, but they control our critical thinking processes, our problem solving. They direct us to move. And so because I wanted my kids to move, I used verbs instead of nouns. And that turned out to be a very beneficial and powerful change in my reading instruction. This is another quote that validates the power of movement. This is from How Babies Talk, and they tell us a tantalizing finding from a number of different laboratories suggests that babies are first capable of learning the relationship between a word and an object only if the name is said as the object moves. So verbs are absolutely critical to kids' earlier language development. So I developed a set of 45 characters to represent all of the sounds in the English language. And this is a chart of those 45 characters. You're going to need pictures of the characters to teach animated literacy. So you can go to our website and go to the section on samples, and there is a black and white chart of all of the characters in animated literacy that you can print, and then you can blow it up to a larger size. You can cut it up into individual pieces, and if you don't have our materials, you can use this as a substitute for your materials at home. Now, as I was developing animated literacy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we went through a period where, once again, just like in the Dick and Jane period of instruction, phonics was considered to be not something children were supposed to be learning. So especially in the 1990s, people who were teaching phonics were very frowned upon in many situations. Then in 2000, the National Reading Panel report came out, and this guided instruction during the No Child Left Behind period. When it came out, what publishers tended to do was go all the way back to the 1840s and 1880s and bring back the decodable text of the Dan Confan-Jan variety of books. And California and other states mandated that children had to be taught through decodable text. But when you look at the actual document, there's a statement in there that says it is critical for teachers to understand that systematic phonics instruction can be provided in an entertaining, vibrant, and creative manner, which is what animated literacy was doing, as opposed to going back to teaching to the test and using decodable text to provide instruction. In 2004, the National Association of Education, in their newspaper, did an article about the lack of joy in reading instruction. And on the front, it says the joy of reading. And on the back, it says, is this essential ingredient missing from the education department's recipe for student achievement? Educators say absolutely. But they went out and they found schools that were in fact keeping the joy of reading alive. This is a picture that they looked at from New Stanley Elementary School in Kansas City, Kansas. So the program that I was developing in San Diego was now being used heavily in Kansas City, Kansas. And here are the students doing all of their gestures for their sounds. So they're bowing for Baby Barnaby, and they're dancing for Daisy Dragon, and they're gliding with Gilda Goose. So for every sound, there is a verb and there's a gesture to accompany that sound. Now, as I mentioned, the first year I used my characters without gestures, not much happened in test scores. But the second year, I attached at least one gesture for every sound. So every time children produced a sound, they also produced a gesture, and my test scores skyrocketed as a result of that. My class went from approximately 18% of my students scoring at or above the 50th percentile on CTBS the year I didn't use gestures, to 68% the year I started using gestures, and the performance remained that way long after. So gestures are one of the key elements to success for students in animated literacy. In terms of storytelling, I had a very interesting experience in 1997. A speech pathologist named Barb Gale up in Orillia, Canada, which is about a 2-hour drive north of Toronto, organized a story and song festival around animated literacy and invited the native storytellers and singers and dancers to the festival. And this was another real enlightening experience for me in terms of how the arts are used in ancient cultures and how we can continue to use them today for the success of our students. I got to meet and talk with many of the native storytellers. And they don't separate storytelling and singing and drawing and movement the way we do. Instead, all of their stories incorporate all 4 areas of the arts. And those 4 areas are storytelling or narrative, singing, movement that can be either dance or gesture, and drawing. And you can see here some of the special native drawing that takes place. And so in teaching animated literacy now, it's really an arts-based program. Everything that I teach integrates all of the arts the same way pre-literate societies have done, because they didn't have books to be able to store their history and culture in. They didn't have hard drives from computers. Everything they taught had to be remembered up here. And so they used very powerful memory devices in order to stimulate emotions and in order to hang those memories on the hooks that go along with context. And as a result of that, they're continuing to use that oral tradition to pass on their history and culture to the generations of today. So thank you very much for listening again. In our next section, we're going to start looking at the specific gestures that I use for teaching sounds and how I use those gestures to develop phonological awareness, and then later how I use those gestures to develop phonics. So thanks again for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next session.